Thank you for being here. Thanks, everyone. I would like to invite you to take a seat. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for being here. We have a star lineup here today, so we're really excited to go ahead and jump right into questions. So I'll start with introductions. I'll try to keep it brief. I know we have limited time to talk about a very important subject, but we have very accomplished people here on this stage today, and I'm very honored to be here with all of you. So I'll start with Rosa Maria Paya. We have Rosa Maria Paya here with us. It's very special to have you here with us today. Thank you so much for being here. Rosa Maria is one of the most important voices for Cuban freedom in the world right now. She's the founder of Cuba Decide, an initiative that calls for free and fair elections in Cuba, and she has spent years being a voice for Cubans both on and off the island. Rosa Maria is the daughter of the late Oswaldo Paya, one of Cuba's most well-known and prominent opposition leaders who was killed by the Cuban government in 2012. And Rosa Maria has carried forward so amazingly his powerful legacy of peacefully defending democracy and human rights. On that note, Rosa Maria was recently elected by OAS member states as commissioner to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights for the 2026 to 2029 term. And I know many of you have already met her before because she does amazing, tireless work, not just in DC and not just in the US, but in the whole region, advocating for Cuba and making sure that it stays top of mind. Rosa Maria, it's an honor to have you here with us.
Thank you so much.
We're also joined, yes, round of applause. Thank
you, Melissa.
We're also joined today by Carrie Filippetti. She's executive director of the Vandenberg Coalition, and she's a distinguished fellow at the Wilson Center. Carrie is someone that I think a lot of us turn to when we want a real, clear, honest opinion on what US policy should look like, especially towards places like Cuba and Venezuela. Prior to her current role, Carrie served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Cuba and Venezuela in the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs, and she was Deputy Special Representative for Venezuela at the US Department of State, for which she received a Superior Honor Award. Carrie, you have a very long and very impressive curriculum, including Senior Advisor to the Havana Incidents Task Force and Senior Policy Advisor for the United States Mission to the UN. Again, I won't list all of your accomplishments for the sake of time, but the last thing I'll say about Carrie is how much I appreciate the way that she is able to translate complex and often in the weeds difficult policy into what it actually means for people on the ground. So Carrie, we're so glad to have you here. Thank you for being here. Thank you. Then we also have Mike Gonzalez. He's currently a senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Mike brings decades of experience and insight into this conversation, not just because he spent 20 years as a journalist, and not just because of his impressive experience both in government and studying and warning for so long about the consequences of socialism and centralized power, but also actually because of his personal experience. Mike's family escaped communist Cuba when he was a child. First, they fled to Spain, and then eventually to the United States. And one of the many reasons that we love Mike is not just because he's an incredible writer and commentator, but because he is not afraid to speak his mind, which I think we always need more of in conversations like these. So it's great to have you with us. Thank you, Mike. Thank you. And finally, last but not least, some of you may have heard me introduce him at breakfast, but we have Dr. Orlando Gutierrez Boronat. He is also a longtime leader in the Cuban democratic movement and somebody that has dedicated his entire life to the cause of Cuban freedom. He is the Secretary General of the Assembly of the Cuban Resistance, and he is co-founder and national secretary of the Cuban Democratic Directorate, and he's also an award-winning author. He is well known for his expertise on Cuba and the threat posed by the Cuban regime. He has spent decades working really closely with Cuban civil society and the exile community, helping document repression and be a voice for people on the island that can't speak freely. He brings both deep historical perspective, but also passion and commitment for the Cuban people. So we're very grateful to have you here with us today. Thank you all so much for being here. I know we have a lot to talk about, so we can go ahead and jump right in. But Rosa Maria, I want to go ahead and start with you. And I'll ask you, for 7 decades, as we all know, Cuba has endured a very harsh and oppressive communist dictatorship and has gone through all of these cycles of economic collapse and then mass outmigration, real pressure on the regime, only to have the current regime remain in control. So for those for those people in the room that maybe not as read in as you are, I know that you're in contact with a lot of people on the island, but can you share a little bit more about what's happening in Cuba right now? I know you're in constant contact. So what is the reality on the ground? Does this moment feel different than the other ones, or does it just feel like another cycle that this regime might manage to survive?
Thank you. Thank you for that question and for the invitation. It's truly an honor, Melissa, to be here and in this very distinguished company. Yes, we are at the threshold of freedom. We are there. It is the reality, at least it is the perception of the Cuban nation. The Cuban nation, as you mentioned, live on and off island only during the last 5 years. The Cuban population on island shrinked in at least 20%, and that talks about the second element that I want to mention when I answer your question, and is the humanitarian catastrophe. At the end of 2020, the estimated population in Cuba was 11.3 million people. Today, experts talk about a little bit more than 8 million people on island. Those are several millions vanished from national territory. Those are not only those who fled. That also talks about those who have died. There are no medicines in the island. Hospitals are collapsing. Hunger is the #1 concern, and the #1 concern in an island in which the regime cannot keep the lights on. The energy crisis is going deeper and deeper. It's gonna get to a point in which even when the thermoelectric has fuel, they're gonna turn on the switch and they're not gonna work. That's gonna happen because that's how the situation have been degenerating in the during the last years. And I wanna be crystal clear in the following: this didn't start on January 3rd, 2026. This is the result of the centralized economy imposed on the Cuban people, the corruption of the criminal group in power, the design of the Castro family that requires to be in power to keep the whole population living in the misery. And also a point that Secretary Rubio have made very clear, and is the incompetence of the group in power in Cuba. And amidst all these crises, the worst of all of them is the political repression crisis. As we speak, there are more than 1,200 political prisoners registered. As you mentioned that maybe there are some in the audience that are not familiar with the Cuban situation, I just want to briefly describe what a political prisoner is. Because we have very important, well-known leaders of the opposition that have been leading civil society organizations and political parties in jail right now, as Felix Navarro, for 3rd time in jail, or his daughter, Saili, that is my age, and it's at prison. It has been in prison for 4 years already, her crime was going to the police station and asking for the kids that were disappeared from the protest the night before. For that action, she has been in jail for 4 years and is condemned to 9 years in prison. What is a political prisoner in Cuba? It's a teenager, 16 years old. His name, Jonathan Muir. What was Jonathan Muir's crime? He, one night, joined the group of protesters in his hometown in Moron, in the center of Cuba, and screamed freedom in the streets. As we speak, he's in a maximum security prison, being tortured at 16 years old, a kid, the son of a Christian pastor. He's being punished for screaming freedom and for being Christian and for being part of a family that has been persecuted for decades in Cuba. Despite the hunger, the lack of medicines, the death, the repression, there is a national conviction on island and on exile, and is that the only way out, the only way to overcome the crisis is to get rid of the dictatorship. And that's why we see these teenagers in the streets screaming freedom. That's why the year 2025 ended with an average of 30 protests a day in a country where mothers struggle to even know if they are going to be able to feed their kids. I think I leave it there.
Thank you so much, Rosa Maria. That's an amazing way to put in perspective what's actually happening there. And Dr. Gutierrez Boronat, I want to invite you to kind of jump in here because I know you also have so much contact with a lot of Cuban civil society and people on the ground. Are you seeing any fear or exhaustion, or also what Rosa Maria described, just this real willingness to challenge the regime? And I'll invite you to take it a step further, and I want to know what you think. What do the Cubans actually want from the United States right now?
Well, first of all, thank you for including me in this panel. Glad to be here, and I want to thank Carrie when she was in state in the first Trump administration. You were very good on Cuba. Thank you for what you did and for the times you visited us and were supportive. And of course, my dear friends Rosa Maria and Mike. I think Rosa Maria has very well explained the existential crisis Cuba is going through. I just want to leave you with two key ideas at the beginning. The Castro regime has been doing everything it's been able to do since 1959 to exhaust Cuban society and the Cuban nation. It's not just that their policies were inept or they were inefficient, it's that Castro realized that to dominate Cuba, he had to break Cuba. And it's very evident in the writings and the speeches, which I have researched thoroughly, of Ernesto Guevara. I don't call him Che because he wasn't my friend. They purposely set out to use hunger, to use scarcity as a tool to break Cuban society. They were afraid of the Cuban middle class in the countryside and the cities, and they had to break it to create a totalitarian state. That's why they never risked elections. So we are seeing the result of a systematic effort to break what was one of the most prosperous societies and countries in Latin America. And I can go extensively into this, but we don't have the time as to what they tried to do. But it is very important to understand this because of two main reasons. Number one, my biggest concern with Cuba is not what may be happening in Venezuela, it's what happened in Nicaragua, where we convince ourselves that the Sandinista National Liberation Front could be reformed, could be rescued, could become a legitimate agent of democratic transformation, and the war that they had lost in the countryside, they won at the negotiation table. So those of us who lived through that process know how dangerous it is. We have a historic inability to understand the nature of the Sandinista National Liberation Front, and we have a historic inability to understand the nature of the Castro regime and its component organizations, and how deep their level of hatred for the US goes, and how deep and how insecure they are about the power in their respective countries. Because certainly, just as in Nicaraguan history, in Cuban history, the Cuban Communist Party, Castroism, has been a virus, sapping away Cubans' energy during its entire stay in power. Cuba is not just facing a loss of population, it's facing a population collapse, negative birth rate, the only Latin American country that is beyond replacement level. The economy has been exported. Having said that, I think it's important to understand that the fuel of Cuban prosperity, the fuel of Cuba's reconstruction lies in Cuba's identity. Cuban national identity has been forged in the resistance to state control under the colony and even under the Republic. Cuban civil society has over and over again shown a great ability to resist state domination and to create its own sphere of work and of cooperation, which has generated Cuban prosperity in all levels. For example, in the US, individually, Jamaicans make larger salaries than Cubans make. However, Cubans as a group are far more powerful economically and politically. As a group, they generate more wealth and more prosperity. And that is the same case with the Cuban diaspora, not just in the US, but for example, in Puerto Rico, which I have studied, and for example, in Venezuela before Chavez. That shows you that the ability of Cuban society to come together, to work together, to cooperate with a minimal state is the essence to recovering Cuban prosperity. Strengthening Cuban identity, and I think that's something very smart that Ambassador Hammer is doing, promoting Cuban democratic nationalism is the way to reconstruct Cuba. And the seed of that democratic nationalism lies in Cuban civil society today, in the diverse denominations of the Christian church, in civil society itself. And it's in that nationalism, which has always been pro-American, American-aligned, seeing the U.S. as an example of nationhood, and which had achieved a great level of positive cooperation with the U.S. before '59, is that the hope lies for a true reconstruction of Cuba. For that to occur, the virus has to be extirpated. Cuba cannot be rebuilt with the Cuban Communist Party or the Castro family, which is the main entity, having any kind of power. They will not allow the country to breathe. We're not exaggerating, we're not overestimating, we're saying what it is. And the positive aspect of that is that they're a tiny minority in a country where, as you asked, there's an overwhelming consensus, even in party ranks, that the Communist Party ranks, that the time has come for profound change and to recover the path Cuba was on before this terrible virus came along. So I think it can happen. I think Cubans can rebuild their nation. I think they can do it, and they must do it in alignment with the United States, and this is the time for that.
Carrie, as we talk about Cuba doing this in alignment with the United States, I want to take this opportunity to take a quick step back and discuss the past and a little bit of history here before we continue to talk about what might happen next. What are the security implications of the relationship between Cuba and the United States? And could you share a little bit more about our history of negotiation with the Cuban regime?
Sure, thank you very much. It really is, I can't express how much of an honor it is to be here, especially next to these two who were really my educators as I was coming into this and really inspired by the fight for freedom that both of you have undertaken. And Mike's a very good friend of mine as well. So when I'm often asked this question, and was in the first Trump administration, why does President Trump care so much about Cuba and Venezuela? And the answer is because he is a domestic president, and people are really surprised by that answer. It's because he understands the clear national security implications for us here in the United States of these dictatorships and authoritarians in Venezuela and then also in Cuba. If you look at his national security strategy, there's a few different things that he specifically highlights as it relates to the Western Hemisphere, all of which are present on the island of Cuba under the regime. The first is the issue of weaponized immigration. The second is drugs and terrorism. And then the third is kicking Russia, China, and Iran out of our hemisphere. So as we tick down those, number one, let's start with Russia and China. There has been a significant expansion of Chinese spy and surveillance bases on Cuba over the last few years. This matters because Cuba is less than 100 miles from the coast of the United States. This gives China the ability to surveil most of the southeastern seaboard of the United States, where we notably have combatant command headquarters, we have military bases, we have space launchers, we have all of the things that are really important for our security that they don't get discovered by the Chinese Communist Party. The second, as it relates to terrorism, Cuba has been designated as a state sponsor of terrorism. They have provided a safe haven for foreign terrorist organizations like the FARC, like the ELN. They recently, in 2019, this is partially why we redesignated them, they refused the extradition of ELN leaders after they committed a bombing in Bogota that murdered 22 people. They shelter FBI most wanted terrorists in the United States, and they supply weapons and training to groups throughout Latin America, including the Maduro regime. We also have seen direct attacks from the Cuban regime on the American public. This is both in terms of their efforts to surveil us using spies within our own system. We all know the stories of how senior US officials were being paid off by the Cuban regime. And I can tell you, being in the US administration, even though many of those individuals have since been put in prison, their influence is still profoundly felt there. And the way that they created these protections for the Cuban regime are still profoundly found there. This is to say nothing of Havana syndrome, which we still don't have a formal answer to why dozens of US diplomats were injured, in some cases irrevocably, by some type of weapon that was used on the island in 2016. And while we don't know that it was the Cuban regime that deployed that weapon, anybody who knows anything about Cuba knows the regime certainly knew it was being deployed and would have allowed the authorization of that. So we have Americans that have been directly injured by it. And then lastly, I'll point out the migration point that Rosa Maria mentioned. So she said it beautifully. We are now at 20% loss over the last few years of the Cuban population. We have seen a huge influx over many years of Cubans desperately trying to leave their island, being forced out of the island. We've seen how that has affected the region as well. Obviously, increased migration puts a significant strain on a number of the countries where they're showing up. And this is where I'll add one final point, because this administration doesn't talk about human rights, and I understand why they don't use that language. I would actually make the argument that as we talk about two central reasons why human rights really does matter. The first is the migration question, which we already pointed out. You know, that's millions of individuals that now need to be absorbed by other countries, including the United States, which puts a strain on our resources. Obviously, in this case, we're very happy to do it, but there is that instability that's caused by the human rights violations that are going on the island. The second is because of all of the things that sort of constitute the founding ethos of America. Why is America America? It is this one central premise that everybody is created in the image of God. And it is from that central premise that human rights is ultimately derived. And so human rights is not a sort of rejection of Western civilization. If we want to defend Western civilization, which this administration rightly speaks regularly about, then actually human rights is central to that, because human rights is central to the products of what Western civilization brought to the world. And so this is why I think even though President Trump doesn't use that language, you can see him heavily motivated by that idea. This is his interest in Iran, it's his interest in Cuba, it's his interest in Venezuela. So I would just mention that because I think it's really important. I'll very quickly answer the negotiations question because I think I've been talking too long. So obviously everybody knows we're currently involved in a negotiation. I will freely admit my skepticism about negotiating with these types of regimes. These are ideological regimes. They do not negotiate, particularly not any individual in the Castro family. There's just entirely too much for them to lose and very little for them to gain. Anytime we try to have any outreach to the Cuban regime, they responded the same way, which is the revolution is not for sale. So they're not really a group that we can negotiate with. But I'll tell you why I'm skeptical of those negotiations. President Obama, when he did his negotiations, if you had asked his team why they were doing it, they believed that that was consistent with Helms-Burton. By that they meant this was consistent with actually finding a pathway to a change in regime over the long term. That was the idea. It wasn't that they wanted to be friends with the regime. It was that they thought, you know what, we tried the hard line, let's try this. And I want to talk a little bit about what the results of those negotiations were. Not only Havana syndrome, which happened in 2016 when the negotiations started in 2014, but let's look at that human rights question. So in 2015, and by the way, this is from Human Rights Watch, which is not known as a sort of conservative bastion, to say the least. But so in 2015, there were 6,000, so the negotiations started 2014. 2015, there were 6,200 arbitrary detentions on the Cuban island. In 2016, that increased to 7,600, and according to the Cuban Commission on Human Rights and National Reconciliation, it was well over 9,900 arbitrary detentions, which was the highest since 2010. Actually, in 2016, there were 827 monthly detentions of Cubans versus 172 in 2010. So we saw a massive spike during the so-called warming of relations. Then, 2017, President Trump comes into power. We start to see a decrease. 4,537 in 2017. In 2018, also under Trump, not specifically because it's him, but because he is increasing the pressure, we see 2,000 arbitrary detentions in 2018. 2019, 1,800. This is when pressure is happening. This is not the warming. And 2020, we saw just over 1,000. 2021, we start talking about reducing that pressure. What do we see? Immediate spike, an increase. 2021, there was 1 month where more Cubans were detained than the entirety of the year prior under the maximum pressure campaign. So when I talk about why I'm skeptical of negotiations, it's not because I'm against negotiations, it's because I see the end goal. The end goal is an improvement in human rights so that we can improve stability in the Western Hemisphere. And unfortunately, the negotiations historically have not shown us that.
Carrie, thank you so much. That's incredibly alarming, and thank you so much for sharing those statistics with us. Mike, I want to bring you into the conversation, and I actually have 2 questions for you, not one, but I'll start by letting you jump in. I know you've written extensively about the threat that Cuba poses, not just to the U.S., but really to the entire hemisphere and to the world. So I don't know if you actually brought your handouts, but I know that you've written, great, amazing, if anybody wants some, but I know you have written about how Cuba has exported death and chaos for 6 decades. Is there anything you wish to add about that?
Yeah, thanks, Melissa, and thanks all of you for being here. I really appreciate it, and this is a great panel to be with. I think, by the way, Oswaldo Payá was one of the great men in half a millennium of Cuban history. When I spoke to him as a journalist, I always felt very proud, and I want to recognize Colombia's Senator Cabal for being here. I was born in Cuba. My family was on one branch, went back to 1511. We played a role in Cuban history. I'm speaking here as an American. When I became an American, I became an American. And American interests are not just upper top of my mind. It's the only thing I have. When I pray for the Cuban people every day with my family, after I pray for the American people. It is, without a doubt, in America's interest to get rid of this cancerous enemy regime that is 90 miles from our border. It has been dedicated from its start, and that's the paper that I wrote that I left in your chairs, to destabilizing the United States. In 1961, barely a year and a half after the rebels came from the mountains, it paid Puerto Rican terrorists to blow up Francis Tavern, where George Washington bid farewell to his soldiers, killed people there. The next year, 1962, it tried to blow up, I think it was 1,100 pounds of dynamite in Macy's, in Bloomingdale's, in Gimbel's, in New York. The FBI stopped it, and since then, people have this wrong impression that Cuba's regime, which by the way bears a hatred of the United States like I have never seen in my life, and I have lived all over the world as a journalist. I was overseas for 15 years. The Soviet Union at its height never hated the United States in its way of life the way the Cuban regime does. China does not. It has devoted its 67 years of misrule to try to undo the American way of life. And to this day, I want to dispel this notion that Cuba is a toothless dinosaur. No. In 2024, less than 2 years ago, when people were demonstrating in New York, the people who took over Hamilton Hall at Columbia University, where I went, when my son went, my son was at Columbia when this happened. You were there. Those people had, an hour earlier, been in downtown Manhattan being trained on how to do this by Manolo de los Santos, the head of the People's Forum, who is a Cuban agent. He's a Cuban agent. He lived years in Cuba. He's constantly there. If you Google him, if you follow him on Twitter, He's constantly having his pictures with the puppet dictator Diaz-Canel taken. He trained them for a couple of hours and then said to them, I want you to go now so you can have time to go to Colombia. Later that year, that was on April 30th. In September, Bruno Rodriguez, the comical, disgusting foreign minister of Cuba, met with dissidents and many more in the Apollo Theater in Harlem, and talked to them about what to do. And he wasn't alone. He was there with Ivan Gil, the foreign minister of Venezuela. So they will waste no opportunity, no chance to do us harm. I think one of the great things about Trump is that he does things that his predecessors never did. We see it all the time. He circumvents the Washington bureaucracy, the institutions. I think I agree with you, Rosa Maria, that he will get this done because he does not kick the can down the road. I'm hopeful. I wish the Cuban people the very best, but it is in our interest to get rid of this enemy regime.
Thank you, Mike. And since I have you, I want to very briefly ask you to take it a step further. There's a lot of water under the bridge, right? But thanks to President Trump's leadership and our Secretary of State Marco Rubio's leadership, there seems to be, renewed hope and real signs of new pressure on the Cuban regime now. However, we've heard for so many years that Cuba is on the brink, or that we are at an inflection point. And I think that's really exemplified well by Andres Oppenheimer's 1992 book, Castro's Final Hour, The Secret Story Behind the Coming Downfall of Communist Cuba, again, 1992. What makes you think that this time will be different?
Because it's Trump. Because Trump wants to do this, and Marco Rubio, who, by the way, has been a fantastic Secretary of State and a fantastic National Security Advisor, and was a fantastic DJ this weekend at a relative's wedding. I think he really understands. Thinks very clearly. He's working alone, virtually, with a handful of people at the State Department that he can trust. 2 months ago, Kendall Meyer died in prison, the Cuban spy who gave U.S. secrets, who was at the State Department for 30 years, and gave the Cuban government secrets. He's not alone. I mean, we had Maria Belén Montes, we have David Rocha. There are other Cuban spies at the State Department. So the fact that Rubio was able, the United States, Trump, were able to do serve this charge on Maduro without the State Department and the Cubans knowing was amazing. So I think that because we have this, the planets are aligned, but also Cubans themselves, I think, I don't have any, by the way, I have one relative left in Cuba, and she is a Spaniard. I have no one else. So I don't have any really direct contact with the island, but when I talk to people, I just talked yesterday with a European ambassador based in Havana, came to see me. They know. They know. The rumor is that Diaz-Canel is going to cough on camera, develop a cough during giving a speech, and then for the good of his health, his recovery, he's going to have to step aside. This is going to happen before Christmas. This is what the diplomatic corps in Havana believes. His days are counted. I think Raul Castro, who's 94, and God is going to take care now of him soon. We don't have to do really anything. But I think they realize, and this is what they're trying to, and I agree with Kerry, by the way. I agree with everything everybody said, that I don't agree in negotiations, but I think if they're negotiating is to make sure that the Castros are not tried in what I believe needs to happen, which is a Havana tribunal. And not just a truth and reconciliation, no, a tribunal that finds people guilty, people who are guilty of crimes, and that are accordingly punished. They're trying to avoid that happening to the Castro family. And I think because if they're doing that, it's a sign to us, I think, that they also realize that the knock on the door is coming.
Thank you, Mike. And I'll kind of make my way back this way. So Rosa Maria, you're next. But as we've discussed, President Trump has made it a real focus of his administration to shift a lot of U.S. policy and strategy back towards the Western Hemisphere. And he's been applying, as Mike said, real pressure to the regime, kind of both directly and also indirectly. because after the U.S. captured Nicolás Maduro in January, they were Cuba's closest regional ally and supporter. But then Cuba effectively lost its main source of subsidized Venezuelan oil. And then roughly at the same time, the U.S. moved to penalize a lot of countries that were also supporting Cuba with oil, like Mexico, which kind of at the time became Cuba's chief external supplier amid Venezuelan declines. So that has tightened a lot of the pressure, and the result has been, we see it constantly on the news, deeper fuel shortages, rolling blackouts, worsening conditions on the island. So I want to ask you, do you think that this maximum pressure is working, and where should we draw the line between effective leverage and perhaps unintended humanitarian consequences?
Again, the blackouts in Cuba didn't start on January 3rd. The massive collapse of the energy system in Cuba started much before, but we started to see national blackouts in 2022 on the island, and they just have been increasing and increasing and increasing. It's not only a problem of fuel that, by the way, the Cuban region had abundantly for decades, and they use it to sell it to Southeast Asia, not to repair and to keep the lights on in Cuba. And as Kerry said, and as I believe all my friends here have mentioned, there is no solely diplomatic way in which the criminals in power in Cuba are going to leave voluntarily. Maximum pressure is required. That maximum pressure should be targeted and directed towards those that are in power. That, by the way, the sanctions that were published 3 days ago opened even a further door for that to happen, because they opened the door for the U.S. government to go for the money of Gaesa. Gaesa is the military conglomerate of the Cuban regime. It's basically the transnational enterprise of the Castro family that lives on criminal activities and extractive activities from the Cuban people, that sits over billions of dollars, at least 18 billions of dollars in offshore accounts. A portion of that is liquid. That those resources belong to the Cuban people, and it is a good sin. It is an important sin that who is the best ally of the Cuban people today, which is the U.S. government under the leadership of President Trump and Secretary Rubio, are going behind those resources, because that's the lifeline of those that are taking the decision today of shutting down teenagers in the streets, throwing them in jail, instead of submitting to the will of the people and leaving. And yes, this time, we are in the threshold of freedom because of the audacity of the U.S. government, because of the conviction of the Cuban people that are risking what they have, which is their bodies, to trying to change that regime, and also because there is a democratic alternative. The one that they tried to kill in 2012 when they murdered my father live on. And the Cuban people and the main forces, the main democratic forces from the Cuban people on island and in exile, we are together behind the Freedom Accord, which basically announced a transition plan and a team working on commissions that take care of every aspect of national life for us to be ready the moment the power fractures. The three elements are necessary in order for a dictatorship to collapse, in the 21st century. You need the organic demand for freedom and the civic mobilization coming from the Cuban people, and it's there. You need the democratic alternative ready to act the moment the power fracture, because it is gonna be necessary a transition process led by the Cuban people and supported by the US government, and let's hope the democracies of the Western, of the West. And you need the real pressure capable of becoming the credible threat in the heads of those criminals that have been there because they have been willing, ready, at every point to use the force, to use the violence, and to kill any democratic alternative. Today, we have the three elements combined, and we need to increase and to intensify them till the moment the power fractures, and that moment is getting closer and closer. And for the US, I totally agree with Gary. It's a matter of what the ethos of the West is, and what defending freedom and human rights represent for the future of every republic in the West, including the US, but it's also a matter of national security. The only reason why we have Maduro in New York, and we're talking about the need for a democratic process in Venezuela, is because for 25 years, the Cuban regime first prop up and helped Hugo Chavez to get to power, and then infiltrated each area of the national life, civil and military, in Venezuela, took control of the military counterintelligence, and helped Maduro to maintain, to keep his power. The only reason we are talking about torture centers in Nicaragua is because of the Cuban regime. The reason why we have had instability across our hemisphere is because of the Cuban regime that has been the element that made impossible democratic stability in our region, from the guerrilla movement to the drug traffickers to the massive and periodic migratory wave that we have seen, especially the last one, that started by an agreement between the Ortega Murillo regime and the Castro regime when they removed the visa restrictions in November 2021. The Cuban regime is the head of the octopus, and is in the best interest of the US to finally tear down the Berlin Wall, which is the Cuban regime, the Berlin Wall of our hemisphere. And I'm gonna end with this because Maria Fernanda is here, and one of the reasons why we are still seeing the situation that we are seeing in Venezuela is because the pleiade of powerful actors that are still acting in national territory. One of them, the ELN, El Ejército de Liberación Nacional, Colombian, they said. No, yeah, it is Colombian, but it's also Cuban. The ELN was trained by the Cuban regime in 1963 in the mountains of the Escambray, in the center of Cuba. Totally created by Fidel Castro and the Cuban regime, until today, co-directed by the Cuban regime, now controlling portions of Venezuelan and Colombian and Colombian territory. So yes, it is a need, it's urgent, it's existential for the Cuban people, but it's a matter of national security and democratic stability, ultimately freedom, prosperity for the whole hemisphere. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosa Maria. And I know that we want to leave a little bit of time for audience Q&A, but I have two quick questions left for you guys, so we'll do a fast and furious round. But Carrie, since Rosa Maria brought up these links between Cuba and Venezuela, and you're an expert in both, I want to ask you, talks about liberating Cuba really accelerated after the capture of Nicolás Maduro on January 3rd. So what do you think are some lessons that we learned about Venezuela? What worked and what didn't?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll try to be as brief as possible. So I try to think about this not as a lesson that we learned as the United States, but what is the lesson that the Cuban regime should be learning from what transpired on January 3rd. And I divide it into a couple of different things. Number one is that we have the will to do this. There has been a lot of talk about the United States not wanting to get involved abroad, not wanting to do anything. I think President Trump has pretty much removed that fear, considering what he did not only in Venezuela, but in Iran, and really around the world. So it shows that we have the willingness to pursue our national interests in a way that was put under question, I think, during the campaigns. The second is that we have the capability, and this is really important. For years, there was this image that the United States, which was once one of the countries that helped storm the beaches of Normandy and free the world, essentially, from the threat of Nazism, that was replaced by the image of the fall of Saigon, the fall of Kabul, as recently as a few years ago. And now that image of the US military has been replaced by B-2 bombers taking out Iran's nuclear facilities. It's been replaced by the idea of these commando units going in under the cover of night and ripping Maduro from his bed and taking him to justice in New York. So it shows that the US military is actually a lot stronger than people realized it was. And it also shows that the US intelligence services are a lot more capable than we thought they were, because for us to be able to conduct an operation like that in the Western Hemisphere in Venezuela means we needed to be deeply, deeply penetrated. And I don't think either the Venezuelans or the Cubans were aware that, that we had that level of penetration. So if I'm the Cuban regime, and I'm learning that the US has the will, the US has the capability, and the US has a red line, which is, if we try to negotiate with you in good faith and you refuse those negotiations, as Maduro did, as the Iranian regime did, then these are the sorts of things that happen to you. So I think that's the clearest message to the Cuban regime, which is currently in a negotiation and currently not negotiating in good faith, claiming that they're releasing prisoners that they're not releasing, et cetera. So I think those are the three main lessons. The last thing that I would highlight is the Cuban regime might look at what happened in Venezuela and take one good lesson from it, which is, well, hold on. I mean, really, the regime's still in power there, right? I mean, Maduro's not there, but you still have Delcy Rodriguez, you still have Diosdado Cabello, you still have Pedrino Lopez, even though now he's Minister of Agriculture. You still have the same infrastructure. So they might think, okay, well, let's do that. Maybe we can negotiate to that. And to that, I would just say, first of all, I don't think the Delcy option is going to work in Venezuela. That's my own personal perspective. But putting that aside, it doesn't work in Cuba because there isn't anybody who can even pretend to be a Delcy Rodriguez. There's nobody who can pretend that they're kind of a moderate. She also isn't, but she can pretend to be. You know, claim, I studied abroad, et cetera. I always love how in the United States, if somebody studied at like an elite university abroad, that makes them a moderate. If you've met any American who studied at an elite university here, does that make them a moderate? I don't think so. So yeah, it's right. Yeah, like the North Korean, like he was in like doing basketball or something in Switzerland. I mean, this does not make somebody a moderate. But Cuba doesn't have anybody that you could even reasonably say is part of the regime now and can sort of run something like this. So I'm hoping that these are the lessons that the Cuban regime takes from Venezuela and sees that they need to take President Trump very seriously. As Mike said, you know, the difference between now and the past is Donald Trump and Marco Rubio, and that's a profound difference.
You led us right into our next question, Carrie, so thank you for that. And my last question is for you, Dr. Gutierrez Boronat. The regime, as we have talked about right now, is weaker than ever. But if it were to collapse, who governs Cuba the next day? I think that's a question on everyone's minds. Is there somebody that the U.S. should empower? And I know that you briefly touched on this in your previous remarks, but is there, I want you to make it very clear, is there any realistic scenario where reform comes from within the regime?
First of all, yes, there is a democratic alternative to the regime. If it falls the right way, which is a real collapse of the regime and of the power structure, Rosa Maria mentioned, you know, the Assembly of the Cuban Resistance and Pasos de Cambio, we've signed the Freedom Accord, which represents the vast core of the civil society inside Cuba and outside Cuba. And there's very many talented people inside Cuba and outside Cuba. Cuba has a lot of leadership, which is repressed by the regime. So yes, there's definitely a democratic alternative, and there's a society that can rule itself and can prosper without this regime there. Number two, I think it's, I want to make this point. It's very, to me, it's essential. Why have negotiations or contacts between the US and that regime historically failed? Because of three myths. Three myths that the deep left in the US injected into geopolitical thinking about Cuba. First myth, the first tragic myth is that Fidel Castro was not anti-American, but we forced him to be anti-American. Completely wrong. Deep hatred for the US is extraneous to Cuban history. That didn't come from Cuban history. That came from Mr. Castro's Nazi and communist obsessions. Second myth, the internal plurality of the regime that we still hear. There's no internal plurality. There's the Castro family and its attendants and its servants. Diaz-Canel leaves tomorrow, doesn't mean a thing. He's got some power within the structure, but he's replaceable. The power lies in the Castro family. It is true that with the death of Raul Castro, there's no visible Castro to take that mantle up. And Alejandro Castro has been sidelined because of his role in the directed energy attacks, because of his role in the directed energy attacks against the US diplomats and clandestine services. The third myth, which has been extremely harmful, is to believe that Cuban history began with Fidel Castro. Those three myths have gone and they've hurt our approach toward Cuba since before 1959. Now, what's different today? You can't write the history of that regime without the American deep left empowering that regime. And you can't write the history of how the deep American left has grown in power without the Castro regime. They have a symbiotic relationship. Famously, Herbert Marcuse wrote in 1961, or he said in 1961, that the Cuban Revolution was essential for socialism in the United States. So the kind of relationship that's been ongoing between the deep American left and the Castro regime cannot be obviated. Why is there hope now? Because we have a presidency who has decided to break with that deep state, that has called into question all these presumptions that deep left brought into American international thinking. That's why we're so close, one of the reasons, and the ongoing struggle of the Cuban people. So I think that definitely there's an option to Castroism. It's a myth that there isn't. Cubans have demonstrated over and over again the ability to generate wealth. Cuba, by 1959, two brief statistics, was feeding itself, which is extremely difficult for a developing country, and was aggressively exporting food, very successfully. Number two, Cuba had the #1 electrical industry in Latin America, thanks to US help and US investing in that industry. It was destroyed by the Castro regime. So without the regime, you're gonna have a prosperous Cuba. There's no reason why we should be doomed to the kind of status quo which has hurt Cubans and hurt Americans for the past 6, 7 years. It's all a myth, it's all propaganda.
Thank you so much, sir. And I know that we could all spend literally all day here in this room. There is so much knowledge on this panel and so much to talk about, but we need to wrap it up soon, and I want to leave a couple of minutes for audience Q&A. If anyone would like to ask a question, Lindsay is in the back with the microphone.
Thank you, great panel. I'll share my experience. When I was a U.S. diplomat on the ground in the 90s in Havana, I noticed that there were always rolling power outages everywhere. There was always widespread desperation for food. I mean, even we had to sometimes hustle to find our food. So things didn't change in that way. I mean, I recognize now, it's 30 years later, and the situation's profoundly different. We can hope. But I would only posit that the most efficient part of Cuba was then the state security service. It was, the intelligence was better than ours. Think about that. Their intelligence was better than ours. And the people who ran the state security apparatus, compare them to the Soviet countries in Eastern Europe in the collapse of communism there. Compare them with maybe Romania. Those people did not leave. They fought in the end, to the end. The Castro family's powerful, but they have a security service, they have people that keep them in power. Where did those folks go? They go to Mexico, do they go to Colombia, or do they fight? So I'll leave that thought.
Who wants to take that? Go ahead, sir.
I think it's a great point. I think the state security apparatus is an entity unto itself. You can't underestimate their loyalty to each other. You can't underestimate the fact that there's 20,000 Cuban mercenaries fighting for Russia in Ukraine. And you also cannot ignore the fact that the Castro regime has a symbiotic relationship with the deep left in the US, but also with Russia. It's a deep connection. They don't have that with the Chinese. They have it with the Russians. So that's not going to go away unless decisive action is taken against that state security apparatus. In recent years, they've been trying to remodel themselves into an Iranian Revolutionary Guard with the creation of the Special National Brigade, the Black Berets. None of that is good for Cuba. None of that is good for the US. None of that is good for Latin America. That must be taken out. The good thing is it's a minority in Cuba, a very tiny minority. And they have the power they have for two reasons. We weren't focused on defeating them in the past. Number two, within Cuba itself, they constitute a very tiny part of the population. They're abhorred by Cubans. They live with a privilege Cubans don't have. The tensions between the regular Cuban armed forces and the Minister of the Interior are well documented, and we're seeing them today. So all those are areas where we could work within to eliminate that threat, but they're definitely a threat. If they're not working for the Castros, they're going to work for the cartels, or they're going to work for Russia. But they must be eliminated because they're a consistent threat. And who must be eliminated? The hardcore leaders of that state security apparatus, whom we know, who have been identified. Those people with power in Cuba would not allow Cuba to function. So I think it's a great point you're making, and it's certainly one of the key pillars of power.
We have time for one more question.
Lucky me, I got the question, I guess, so I'll keep it real short. So we heard a lot of variables here in terms of the time is good now because Donald Trump's in and he has a track record and they should take the lessons learned, but yet they have a security service and a structure. There's a hatred of Cuba. Can somebody take us past the variables into what a deal might look like? I mean, one day we're going to wake up, there'll be a deal. Under what real world scenario would anybody in Cuba cut a deal with us? What would that even look like?
If you read the American press, a lot of them will say that the deal is going to be economic only, leaving the infrastructure in place. I really don't think that's going to happen. I very much doubt that's going to happen. I think that because of Trump and Rubio, sorry to go to them again, I think they understand that the political structure has to go. The regime has to go. And that's the only deal that would work, in my opinion. I don't know what the rest of them have.
That's the only deal, and that's why calling it negotiations is not exactly the best description of what is going on as of right now. I'm not part of that table, but what we are seeing and what President Trump and Secretary Rubio himself has said to the public is that they are increasing the pressure over those criminals that have the decision power right now. The only way out to the crisis, the only way to overcome the crisis is for them to leave. The cost that they are going to impose on that exit is still to be known. We know that they are criminals. We know that they are capable of violence and worse than that. We know that. And that's why it's so important to target their personal, familial, existential interests. And it is urgent because of what you mentioned, Melissa, and it's the security threat that they poses, but also the catastrophic humanitarian situation to which they have forced an entire population. The good news is that now it's possible because of the combination of the three elements.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Let's give it up for our incredible panel. We have a little bit of time to mingle. The next panel starts at 10:45, so feel free to get a drink, run to the restroom. Thank you all so much.